Hello everyone. So in this video, we'll talk about Xenophanes' natural philosophy. We have quite a few fragments, but we don't have a very systematic cosmology from him. But nevertheless, we have enough fragments which give us a hint of, more systematic cosmology, though some of it could just be taken as critique of, traditional cosmologies, as we already mentioned in the very first video. So I'll read out a couple of fragments from his natural, philosophy fragments, and then we'll discuss them to see what kind of idea of cosmology and natural philosophy we can get from Xenophanes. So, fragment 27. From earth come all things, and to earth all things resolve. This fragment is pretty sort of tricky because this gave some people the idea that Xenophanes had earth as arche. Now, this is to be taken with a huge, huge pinch of salt because the other fragments then would contradict it. Yeah, and this is also because a lot of people in the doxographical tradition like to have these, it's a grammarian's dream to have like filled categories. So you have Thales who says air is arche, and Xenophanes who says Thales who says water is arche, and Xenophanes who says air is arche. Then you have Xenophanes who says earth is arche, and Heraclitus who says fire is arche. Well, the last two are doubtful. Yeah, and Xenophanes is definitely doubtful, even more than Heraclitus, where you do have some arche-like elements with fire. But with Xenophanes, you don't even have properly an arche, because remember, it's an eternal universe. The God is also eternal. Not born doesn't die, and in this sense, there is no beginning to things. But yeah, apart from that, what we will also see with the next fragments is that, for example, fragment 29, where he says, everything that is born and grows is earth and water. Yeah, the second thing is added, water, and this is a pretty important distinction to make because even with Hesiod, if you remember, you had Gaia and Uranos, but what of Uranos? The rain from the Uranos. It's actually a popular idea. You had it in Hesiod, and it's a popular idea that we even now have of the origin of things being a combination of earth and water, like earth being like Mother Earth, the idea of the Mother Earth, but the Mother Earth is fertilized, irrigated by rain, by water. And so it's moistness that, gives birth to life. The idea of even spontaneous generation has always contained some idea of moistness. It's not dry earth that gives birth to things. Dry earth is supposed to be one of the signs, one of the metaphors for, things being dead and not alive, not fertile, infertility, dry. So Mother Earth is fertile and fecund when moist. Right? So this fragment 29, adds this, right? Everything that is born and grows is earth and water. And then fragment 33 adds to it and says, for we all come forth from earth and water. Yeah? And if you wanted some addition to, because then you say, okay, yes, you have earth and water in all three, but one of them is only about earth, then fragment 30 will give you a lot about the sea, yeah, a lot about water, where he says, the sea is the source of water and the source of wind, for there would not be the force of wind blowing forth from inside clouds without the great sea, nor river streams, nor rainwater from the sky. But the great sea is the ancestor of clouds and winds and rivers. And if you remember, we had this thing from Homer as well, from the Iliad, and we talked about it in the very sort of first one, where we talked about Okeanos, where he says, Okeanos is the source of all waters. Let me just find it. From whom indeed all rivers and all sea and all springs and deep wells flow. Yeah. So here, though, Xenophanes doesn't use the word okeanos, but he uses the more sort of general word thalassa, right? Sea, ocean, but in the sense of the physical entity, not the mythological, personalized entity. The physical entity, the sea, is like thalassa, which is a source of water and the source of wind and source of, and it's very interesting that, it's the sea that is a source of wind, because this wind blows forth from inside clouds. Yeah, and then the sea is the source of river streams and rainwater and everything, and all that comes from the sky, and is the ancestor of clouds and winds and rivers. And the clouds, of course, then we will see in his later meteorology and cosmology, is where the sun and the rainbows and everything come from. So it's and the stars as well, perhaps. So the clouds take a very, very interesting and important place. But let's stick first with this idea of earth and water, this combination of earth and water. So as we already said, there was this popular idea that everything, including human beings, including, living creatures, were composed of earth and water. Yeah, and if you think about it, even a rudimentary physical theory would say that the earth is earth and sea. That's what you would see, and whether he was in Colophon, which was coast of Turkey, or later on in Sicily, where basically there was earth and water all around, he would have this idea of the world, the world that we live on being earth and water, and like Homer, when he says, that it is a source of all rivers and rains and clouds and winds, but at the same time, he's not really claiming it in a personal way, as you noticed, right? It's not Okeanos, the god, married Tethys and is the begetter of all gods, not at all, right? This thalassa is where, and it's a physical theory, it's a physical cosmological theory, where from this sea, from this thalassa, come wind and clouds and rain and rivers. So it's a physical sort of entity, the sea and its effects. Like it's somewhat mechanical as well, as with the philosophers. Yeah. So we can't really say, as I said originally, that earth is arche or water is arche. In fact, we have a twofold arche if you really want to think of it in terms of arche, right? You have the idea, as I said, of earth and water, of dry land and irrigation, right? The idea of fecundity of the earth coming from irrigation, right? Not when it is, not when it is dry. When it is dry, there is the earth does not, pour forth with its gifts at all. You don't have grass and trees and flowers and fruits and all kinds of things. The fruits of the earth only come when irrigated. And from which then all creatures are born. So when he says we all come from that, we all come from this earth and water combination. In fact, you had this this earlier word, I'm forgetting it, not hule, but the idea of mud or slime, right? So that everything comes from this mud or the slime. So we have a very now clear idea of what the earth, what sort of this universe is composed of. Then you also have this notion of a flat-topped earth. For him, the earth is flat. Well, earth and water, think of it together. And he says, Fragment 28, of earth, the upper limit, which we see by our feet, touches air, AER, which is, remember, the lower atmosphere, but underneath it continues indefinitely. Now, this is interesting, right? When with Homer or Hesiod, we had Tartarus that extended as far below us as sky was above us. Here we have more this idea of this indefinite earth, which means that if it is extending indefinitely, it's a flat-topped earth. It's not a spherical earth. Yeah? So we were talking about a spherical universe, perhaps, a spherical God, more like. But the earth is something flat-topped and extending indefinitely, right? And where we are at its top, right? So we are at its upper limit of the earth, and we're touching air. The upper limit touches air. So we are looking up into the sky, we are on the top part, and below it is this infinite extension of the earth. Then, this is what we have about the earth, but then he also has a kind of cosmogony, let's say, where he talks about what we could call an alternation of wet and dry ages. In fact, the one fragment we have, it's not a very long fragment, where he says, "And in some caves, water drips down." I mean, just listening to this fragment, you would not think that it amounts to much, right? It's like in some caves, water drips down, dripping water. Like, what is he going on about? So we have a few testimonia, though, where perhaps they had access to more fragments, or perhaps they imagined a lot out of it. So we have one, I think this is from, I've not noted it down, but probably Pseudo-Plutarch, where he says, "In the course of time, the earth is continually slipping down and gradually moving into the sea." Right? It's a reverse Anaximander, where in Anaximander, the sea was moving away and the earth was drying out. Here we have, the earth is slipping down and moving into the sea, so like this kind of a imagination of a flood. Or you have this, let me just find this quote in Kirk and Raven, because it's a long one, from Hippolytus, where he says, Xenophanes thinks that a mixture of the earth with the sea is going on, and that in time the earth is dissolved by the moist. So, as I said, the same sort of idea that it's dissolving into the sea. He says that he has demonstrations of the following kinds. Shells are found inland and in the mountains, and in the quarries in Syracuse, he says that an impression of a fish and of seaweed has been found, while an impression of a bay leaf was found in Paros in the depth of the rock. And in Malta, flat shapes of all marine objects, fossils, sea fossils, found on land. Very, very interesting. All mankind is destroyed whenever the earth is carried down into the sea and becomes mud, and there is another beginning of coming to be. And this foundation happens for all the worlds, right? So this idea of a cycle, earth is destroyed and born again. But let's focus first on fossils, right? He's talking about these fossil impressions, this idea that Earth at one point must have been mud, right, of some sort, because plants exist in what is rock. Fish is what is dry in what is dry land. Right, so the idea that you have these fossil impressions of fish, of plants in rocks. How would you have an impression of a plant in a rock? It doesn't make an impression normally. So it must have been like softer rock in which it created an impression, and then it dried out and it became this hard rock. So these fossil impressions give us a very sort of strong idea, and gave it to Xenophanes about the sort of interpenetrability, the changingness of water and earth. And also an idea of the cycle of earth and sea, that at some point the sea must have extended all the way here. That's how we have this fish on land. And it has receded, but it will come back, because remember, water drips down in caves. And we'll get back to that as well, because one of the idea there is that he might be talking about stalactites, right? That is water dripping down, and these rocks are basically water dripping down, which have solidified, and they're still dripping down. So like Anaximander, as I said, he has an idea that living creatures come from this combination of earth and water, from the slime or mud. But unlike Anaximander, who would say that the earth is drying out, though with Anaximander as well, you always have this balance and redressal, and this battle between different sort of opposites within the apeiron. With Xenophanes, there is an idea of the earth dissolving into water, and this idea of a great flood, and the earth is turning back into, the solid earth is turning back into slime and mud, and then eventually the sea. So this imagination that we see of like this great drought, as we see in Anaximander, or this great flood that we can imagine in Xenophanes, is for example, in the Deucalion, right? So there's this Greek imagination that, there were these great natural disasters, these huge natural disasters, these floods and these, these big droughts, in which all humans, or most of the humans, were wiped out, and then the world restarted. And this is not just the Greek imagination, it continued on, it continues on in our imagination, this apocalypse, apocalyptical destruction of the world, and then sort of a re-beginning. And the idea also of a great year or of great seasons, that we're living in one season and this year will end and the new one will come back. And from this, we also get this idea, which we'll see in Empedocles mostly, of innumerable worlds, but in time, that, the world is going through cycles and being formed over and over again. New worlds are being formed with the destruction of the old. We don't know whether it's there in Xenophanes at all, but, we can imagine, we can project. So, but it's not the whole cosmos that is being destroyed. It's just the Earth that is also not being destroyed, but just going through this process of shifting between Earth and sea, because it's anyway a combination of Earth and sea. So, when we said that for Xenophanes, the cosmos was ungenerated and indestructible, this is what we can then get from it. So the innumerable worlds idea is, a bit far out for Xenophanes at least. So we have this idea of alternation of dry and wet, and this alternation of earth and sea. And it is from this really, because we have then mud, because that moist earth only comes when the two combine, but they also sort of destroy each other. But it's only from there that then we have the generation of creatures. We have any kind of fertility in the world, which only comes from this, combination of earth and sea. So did he have anything to say about meteorology and astronomy and the sun and the sky? Well, yes, but it's very unclear. The cosmology here becomes, like with Anaximenes, we were pretty confused with some things that he said. Even here, there are some things that he says which are a bit confusing, but let's go over them anyway. So fragment 31, that's not confusing, where he says, the sun goes over the earth and warms its surface. Yeah. So the rotation of the earth, rotation of the sun, sorry. But here, given that the earth extends indefinitely, so we should not think this way, but maybe this way, it goes over to different lands of the earth or something. And then you have one about the rainbow, where he says, she whom some call Iris is a cloud by nature, seen to be purple, red, and yellow. So the rainbow itself is a cloud, The idea is that, it's a colorful cloud. And then we have these doxographical evidence from Hippolytus and Pseudo-Plutarch and Aetius, which I had better read out because I cannot quote all of them from memory, unfortunately. So let me just find it. Yeah. So this first one is from Hippolytus, where he says, Xenophanes said, that the sun comes into being each day from little pieces of fire. And the word he uses is puridon, I think. Let me just remember what it is. Puridia, the little fires, sparks or little filets, little pieces of fire. So the sun comes into being each day from little pieces of fire that are collected, and the earth is infinite and enclosed neither by air nor by the heavens. There are innumerable suns and moons, and all things are made of earth. So too many things going on in this fragment, or rather this testimony. So the sun comes into being each day. So every day a new sun is formed. How is it formed? From little sparks, little pieces of fire that are collected. How are they collected? Well, we assume through some kind of an evaporation from the sea, because it comes out from the sea, but we'll see whether that makes sense or not. And the earth is infinite downwards. We already talked about that. And so it is not enclosed by air or by heaven, which is only above it. So it's only on the upper limit that we find air and heaven. Below, earth continues indefinitely. And then this strange idea that there are innumerable suns and moons and all things are made of earth. So different parts of the world will have different suns and different moons, right? And everything is made of earth. Okay, this gets a bit tricky. Then next fragment, which we have from Pseudo-Plutarch, is he says that the sun and the stars come from clouds. I mean, this is a fun idea, right? So from the sea, the clouds come forth. From the clouds, who somehow ignite and become these little sparks, and then these little filets sort of gather together and form the sun, and then form these little stars everywhere. And Xenophanes says that the sun is made of ignited clouds, and this one is from Aetius. Theophrastus and the physical philosophers wrote that it is made of little pieces of fire collected together from the moist exhalation, and themselves collecting together the sun. Yeah. So very interesting idea of all these sparks sort of getting together and forming, different heavenly bodies and the sun. And then we have this one, which we already talked about, what they call iris, or the rainbow, is also a cloud, purple and red and yellow to behold. And then this last one, again from IISER, which again talks about, Xenophanes said that there are many suns and moons according to regions, sections, and zones of the earth, and that at a certain time the disk is banished into some section of the earth not inhabited by us, and so treading on nothing, as it were, produces the phenomena of an eclipse. I'm not sure I follow. The same man says that the sun goes onwards ad infinitum, but seems to move in a circle because of the distance. So this one is a slightly more bizarre fragment, but you get the idea of the kind of cosmology that he is giving, right? So from this doxographical tradition, what do we gather? We gather that these heavenly bodies are first a concentration of these fiery particles, of these sparks, right, that collect together to form the sun, the moon, the stars. The other thing we find is that they are ignited clouds, yeah? Or they are these puridia, these embers, these little sparks, right? So the rainbow we know is a cloud, he says that very clearly. But then all heavenly bodies are also these luminous clouds, because this other one that we have where, the sun is this cloud, it comes from a cloud. So is he, going a bit far out, but because we discussed Anaximenes last week, so is he actually, coming up with some kind of an Anaximenes-like theory of condensation and rarefaction? We're pushing it a bit because we don't have any evidence there. And we don't even have real fragments. You saw our only fragment was about the sun going around and the rainbow being a cloud, but we don't have anything about these puridia. These are all testimony. But he could be giving something like Anaximenes about the sun, the moon, the stars, and everything as being these condensed sort of cloud sparks that then form, these heavenly bodies. So very, very pretty sort of ideas of cosmology, but not that much of a clear cosmology or cosmogony that we can get from Xenophanes. His strengths really lie elsewhere, I would say. Or maybe they did, but from the fragments that we have, his strengths lie elsewhere. So, theology we already talked about, and in the next video we'll talk about his epistemology. But before that, let me just summarize, because this was a bit complex, summarize his cosmological achievements, or cosmological explanations, I should say, not achievements. So basically he said that earth and water are basic forms of matter, yeah. Sounds like he said that clouds, wind, rain, rivers, everything came from the sea, and perhaps also celestial bodies, so that air and fire all come from the sea. Water then becomes all of these. So maybe there is some condensation, rarefaction going on. We don't know, right? Then we do know that he says that the earth extends downwards indefinitely, and that we are on the upper surface of this earth, and the air is above this earth and not surrounding it all over. And then finally that the earth and sea go through cycles of flooding and then drying out, and in which there's new generation and new destruction of life forms. And we have this neutral form of matter, which is a mixed form of earth and water, which we can call mud or slime, right? So everything comes from mud, if that's what you want to claim as the arche for Xenophanes. Thank you.